One day in the middle of May 1951, a deep sadness fell across the horrendous Pyeongtaong prisoner of war camp in Korea. And the sadness had come about because one of the American units being held there, their chaplain, Father Emil Kapan, had fallen seriously ill, and the guards had arrived to take him to the hospital. The guards called it the hospital, but all the prisoners knew that it was code for the camp's death chambers, where they would leave sick prisoners to die. And as the men of the unit quickly realized that their chaplain was going to be taken away from them, deep sadness overcame them. They began to cry, some of them physically shaking in terror. They began to beg the guards not to take him from them, some of them even willing to put up a bit of a fight. But their chaplain, Father Kapan, was serene and peaceful, insisting for the men not to be sad and not to fight. He was being carried off, and he asked the guards for forgiveness if he had harmed them in any way. And as he was being carried off on his stretcher, he raised his hands and blessed the guards. To understand the deep distress of the men being separated from their chaplain, you have to understand a little bit of his deep service to them in the years previous. In the absolute horrors of war, he was a beacon of light for all of them. Fearless, absolutely fearless on the battlefield, he risked his life countless number of times to save the men of his unit, himself, or to administer them the sacraments with mortal danger to himself under gunfire. And whilst out in the field, he was given many opportunities to go home. And each time he was given that opportunity, he chose to stay with his unit. Eventually, he ended up in Pyeongtaong with his men. And whilst in the camp, his loving service to them continued. He would get up every morning and sneak around and gather up sticks in order to start a fire to melt snow. And he would capture the melted snow into little aluminium bowls that he made with his own hands with scraps he found around the camp, so his men had water to drink when they woke up in the morning. The conditions in the camp were so horrendous that if one of the men lost the will to live, all they had to do was stop picking the lice off their skin, and within a few days they would pass away. But if anyone was too sick to do that themselves, Father Emil would sit beside them and pick the lice off their skin for them, literally saving their lives. He would sneak around once again in the evening, every night after dark, and go from hut to hut, leading the men in secret prayer services, quiet under their breath, so they weren't shot. One of the soldiers who survived that camp said his very presence would turn a mud hut into a cathedral. And he had a unique ability to instill in the men the one thing that they needed, the will to live, the will to keep living. Knowing a tiny bit of what this man did for his unit and how much they relied on him, it's not hard to understand their deep sadness at the thought of his absence. All goodbyes are difficult, some more than others, but when you're forced to say goodbye to a man who has saved you from dangers, provided water for you in your thirst, has healed your wounds, and has instilled in you a hope and a future when there was absolutely none, the difficulty would be unimaginable. That goodbye would have been horrendous. You would think that the goodbye that the apostles had to give to Jesus on the day of the Ascension would be the same sort of goodbye. One of deep sadness and distress. Another man, Christ, who had been with them in their trenches, sharing their lot and serving them continually. Someone they had begun to hang their entire lives on was now going to be out of reach, out of sight, was now going to be absent after his ascension. However, the absence and the separation that the ascension of our Lord marks does not engender sadness in the apostles. We see the opposite. They take it so well. We hear in the Gospels that the apostles don't return to Jerusalem weeping and despairing, but they return full of joy and are found continually in the temple praising God. The reaction of the apostles, one of joy and praise, rather than one of sadness, points us to the true meaning of the ascension. Their lack of sadness at Jesus' definitive departure teaches us that we're not to look at Jesus' ascension as an absence, but to celebrate it with them for what they saw it as, a new form of presence, a new and unheard of intimacy and communion between God and humanity. That's what the ascension is. There's two pieces of information in our readings today that help us understand that Jesus' ascension is not an absence, but a new form of presence. First, it says that the cloud took Jesus from their sight. Now, this doesn't mean that on Jesus' ascension day, he ascended up into the clouds and kept going and going and going and going. The cloud in the scriptures always denotes the presence of the divine. We hear about it in the Old Testament when the divine is present on Mount Sinai or over the tabernacle, the cloud descended. Or at Jesus' transfiguration where his divinity is revealed, the cloud was there. So Jesus ascending, being taken away in a cloud, doesn't mean he's going far up into the universe. If we keep going further and further to a distant star in space, we'd find him there somewhere. But it means he's entering into the very heart and the mystery of God, returning to his Father. And when he goes there, he takes our humanity with him. He takes our human nature with him. Human nature is entering into the divine presence for the very first time. It says Jesus sits at God's right hand. To sit at the right hand in Hebrew culture was to denote perfect equality. So Jesus ascends to sit at the right hand of the Father, to share with the Father his divine presence that isn't confined just to one space or time, but fills the whole of creation. When Jesus was on earth before his ascension, he was limited himself to the time and space where he was. But now, he's present to all creation. He takes his love, he takes the fruits of his sacrifice, he takes his salvation and makes it accessible to all peoples at all times. At different times, our Christian life can be characterized more by the absence than the presence of Jesus. In different seasons, the absence of Jesus can come to dominate our life. He can seem so far away, so hard of hearing, so weak and so slow to act. In a way, it's sometimes easier to believe that he really did leave us on that ascension day. But the joy of the apostles should spur us on in these moments to seek more earnestly Jesus' presence and closeness. He has promised that today does not mark an absence. I am with you always, even to the end of the age. He has promised that. When our faith is shaken and tested, we should not just take the apostles' word for it, but take the experience of thousands of saints we do know and millions of saints that we don't know, whose beautiful lives testify to Jesus' presence and closeness in many different ways to his church. And above all, today's feast should fill us with the confidence and hope, as our prayers say, that where Jesus, our head and founder, has gone before, we too, his body, will ascend.